So Jared and I are going to be your two presenters today. The bulk of the information is going to be coming from Jared. So a little bit about sort of who I am and who we are. Jared, if you want to hit the next slide. So I own a company and helped found it called 42 Lines. We're the maker of a product called Harmonize. Our passion is inside the online classroom, making sure that all of that communication, the discussion, the asynchronous, the chat, the et cetera, works really well so that instructors can do their job without having to fight with technology. That's kind of our thing. And so throughout this webinar today, you'll hear me chiming in about things in the discussion arena, in the communications arena. That is really my specialty. But I also have with me Jared, and I'll let him do a more introduction about himself as we go. And he's going to be your expert on all things blended learning. For those that didn't submit a question, which it seems like, gosh, a million people submitted questions, we had too many that we could possibly get to. So what we're going to do is we're going to group all of those questions we grouped them into sort of categories, and then Jared and I are going to discuss those categories and try to answer them. But there is also a Q&A pod, so you can go ahead and ask questions as we go as well. I'll be paying attention to that when Jared's speaking. Heather will be paying attention to that when I'm speaking. And if it's a really question that pertains, we'll get to it, try to get to it in line. And if not, we'll make some space at the end to try to answer those questions. But I think we have.
And
go ahead.
And I would add, everyone, if you have answers to other people's questions, please go ahead and provide those. And certainly as we're talking about some of the specific questions and the topics, a lot of the questions had to do with best practices and research on best practices and blended. There's no way that I'm going to know everything about all of these questions. A lot of you in this community today will have insights as well, and perhaps references that you can point others to. So please do that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is going to be a learning for everyone. Also of note, we'll record it and we will send it out afterwards. So if you have to take off for whatever reason, because life is troubling and difficult at times right now, we'll send out a recording so you can catch up. All right. I think the next slide is, so real quick, we just wanted to get a feel for who was here so that we can tailor some of the things we're asking about to the type of audience we have. So are you an instructor, are you an instructional designer, et cetera, so that we can, if we start to dive too deep into an area, we can remind ourselves, oh, we didn't have anybody who cares about that in the webinar, and so we can stay away from those types of topics. So I'm going to give everyone just a few more seconds to be able to answer this. Just initial results. I feel like I'm calling in results on election day. Preliminary results show that instructors and instructional designers are leading, but mail-in ballots are waiting to be counted.
Could you please, Marcus, could you please call the election for us?
I wish I had that kind of power. So it looks like we do have some department chair, distant learning specialist with us, director of online learning as well, academic affairs dean. That sounds good. So I think we can go ahead and roll on from where we're at. And I think now it's over to you, Jared, to take it away.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about blended learning this year in response to the pandemic. And I don't want to dwell on the situation that we're facing right now. We're all very, very keenly aware of the challenges and the struggles. But also, I think a lot of us are thinking about the opportunities to help our faculty do more with technology and to adapt their teaching to be more active, perhaps more flexible for students. And so we really did want to talk about blending, both how it helps students and teachers independent of the pandemic, but also how to think about it in context of the pandemic. So I'm going to start just by a broad definition of blended learning based on some of the questions that you all have provided. Here's a sampling of those. As I said, a lot of these questions throughout this presentation are focused on best practices and focused on, what does the research say about blending or specific practices related to blending. So we'll start here with a broad definition of blending. We'll talk a little bit about the research that is pretty well documented and available. And then I want to separate some of the different kinds of blends that we've seen in the past and are seeing today through the pandemic. So Blending really is just a combination of technologies in teaching and learning. You traditionally think about blended as part of a spectrum, where on the far left, you have traditional face-to-face, which is fully on site, although some learning, of course, takes place off-site on the student's own or with their peers. The other end of the spectrum is a fully online course where learning happens completely via technology, is entirely mediated in that way. And it's important to note that while most fully online education is primarily asynchronous, it can also be synchronous as well, just as an on-site face-to-face experience might be. So blended really is anything in between those two. Now, there are some ways of distinguishing different types of blends, both in terms of the format and the structure, but also in terms of the desired goals that you may have for teaching or for learning. As far as the research goes, I tend to point first to this 2013 meta-analysis that looked at the effectiveness of online and blended learning, primarily focusing on studies that contrasted either face-to-face classrooms with blended classrooms or face-to-face classrooms with online classrooms. And what this meta-analysis broadly found was that there was no significant difference between online and face-to-face, but blended did have an advantage, especially over face-to-face classes, and that the advantage reported through this meta-analysis was significant. Now, the question is why? In this particular study, they didn't come to really strong conclusions, but they did identify some course practices, some teaching and learning practices that seemed to be the moderators of this effect. And those included the fact that a blended course includes asynchronous communication, that it is heavily weighted toward teacher and peer interaction, that it is designed for feedback, that it does include the face time that students value, and that blended courses tend to enable more time on task or practice. Now, if I were to summarize that, I would say a blended course, as opposed to a traditional face-to-face course, is deliberately designed, or it's redesigned, to take advantage of the technology and to ensure that the design is leading to the right outcomes. Also, a blended course is flexible for both the students and the teachers. There is still the advantage of that face time. You have that immediacy, that personal connection. But you also have the flexibility to complete other learning activities and tasks on your own, wherever you want, whenever you want, even when those are interactive and collaborative with others. And third is just that blending gives faculty the opportunity to choose the best of both worlds, and in some cases gives students that opportunity as well to choose the best of both worlds.
Quick
I'm
question
having
came in,
some
Jared.
slide problems here. Yeah, let's see
They
if
were
we can get
asking
the
if
slide to fixed.
yeah, while you're futzing with technology, they are asking, is this university students, community colleges, or combination? Do you happen to know in that particular study?
Yeah, in that meta-analysis, they didn't distinguish between, well, they did in the individual studies, right? But it included community college and university situations primarily. I'm doing a full refresh of my slides here to make sure that this works going forward.
I think it's also good to point out that a lot of you may be hearing face-to-face and thinking like face-to-face. But
Yeah.
a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, if you replace face-to-face with Zoom, a lot of the paradigms still exist and still work. And that's some of the parallels we're going to draw as we go through here.
That's right. That's right. Even though a lot of us don't have the opportunity to meet with students face-to-face, or we have limited or restricted opportunities to work together face-to-face, there are some parallels with the synchronous online that you might have via video conferencing, but there are also limitations there as well, as I'm sure many of your instructors have realized. So thinking further about why blended tends to produce better outcomes, we can look also at research that's focused on online education specifically and on general teaching practices. So of course, with an online course or a blended course that uses online discussions, students have a greater opportunity to participate. They have more time to consider responses, to compose those responses. And what the research shows on these online discussions is that students perceive them as being more equitable and more democratic because more people can participate. So specific research from the realm of online education, but applies to blended, and I think hints at some of the reasons why it might be more effective. In the same vein, here's an example of a study that, while it didn't look specifically at blended courses, it did look at the use of video as part of learning. And so in this particular study, it was quite interesting. They compared students who received instruction in a live situation, received instruction in a video situation with no playback controls, and then video as we're all used to it, right, with the ability to rewind or pause or go fast or go slow. And what they found is that giving students the video with controls resulted in higher scores. Now, I think this comes back to the fact that, you know, technology's big power here is in its reusability, in the fact that students have some control over the pacing of their learning and the ability to go back and review materials. So again, another
Awesome.
indicator as to why blending might be more effective. The content, for example, can be reviewed and worked through by students at their own pace. And Marcus, another
Yeah, I
question?
was gonna say the thing, a lot of feedback we're getting about the video usage in our tools is that for students who um, are learning English as a second language, it's amazing. And then closed captioning for those videos for people who have a disability is also amazing. And even for people who don't, to be
That's
able
right.
to sit in a coffee shop and consume because they don't have a headset that works or whatever it is. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
nice technology bonuses there.
Yeah, and in a little bit, we'll talk how video can be combined with asynchronous discussions and what impact that might have on students as well. So this is a little bit of the research that I think points to why blending might be more effective than traditional online or traditional face-to-face. But let's talk a little bit about some of the different types or species of blends. One of those types is one that I think you've probably heard about if you've not tried it yourself, and that's called the flipped classroom model. And what the flipped classroom model is, it basically says, you know, when we are on site as a class, usually that time is reserved for direct instruction by the teacher. Perhaps that's lecture plus discussion. And there is time for students to practice, but that practice is usually in the form of homework, and it's usually done offsite on the student's own terms. Well, flipping basically just turns those two around. It says that instruction, direct instruction, should be online and usually in the form of video so that students can watch it on their own time, at their own pace, rewind, review, all those things we just talked about being powerful with video. And the practice actually moves into the on-site environment so that it can be observed directly by the instructor and scaffolded and you know, even collaborative with peers. So that's the flipped classroom model. We talk about a kind of model called hybrid as well, where you're basically trading some of the on-site time that you might traditionally spend in the classroom for the flexibility of online learning. And so this represents sort of what you would do in a traditional 3-credit Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. You meet on those days, and then students go off and do their studying, maybe that evening, maybe on Tuesday. But this is where I think the flexibility and the power for instruction of blending comes into play, because you can think about what happens outside of the class as just one long continuum. Instead of it being moving one class online, you basically have an online environment where any number of different learning activities can be structured and can happen. And so thinking about it in that way, I think is helpful for instructors who are new to blended, because they might think, well, I've got a Wednesday class, that Wednesday has to be online, that's all the time I can plan for. When in fact, you should realize that students are doing a lot of learning offsite on their own. That can be structured online, that can even be done online with peers. And so in a hybrid mode, you know, you're going to have some face-to-face meetings, but you're also going to have the opportunity for online activities and reduced, you know, seat time. One of the models that's gotten a lot of attention in the pandemic is the high flex model. Now, a high flex course really is a fully online course, full stop. Now, it's a fully online course that then adds the opportunity for students to meet face to face. And so even though it could be completed fully online at students' discretion, all the activities are there for them to work through, all the materials they need are there. It adds in the on-site sessions so that students can choose to attend if they want and to get additional help or get some direct instruction or whatever it might be. We do see a kind of high flex in the current pandemic, but many times it's not what you would call a true high flex because it's not a fully online course to begin with. It doesn't have the full flexibility for students. It tends to look something more like this, where maybe it's a Tuesday, Thursday class, and instead of meeting every Tuesday, Thursday, uh, some students will meet on Tuesday in social distance environment, while other students will attend that session virtually or perhaps watch a recording of it. Whereas those students who happen to be allowed to attend on Tuesday may only be allowed to attend virtually on the Thursday, and you're sort of rotating students through the system. So it is a kind of high flex, but without the benefit of full flexibility for the students. And oftentimes, these are not fully designed or intentionally designed online courses to begin with. They're usually face-to-face courses that are doing some virtual learning as a substitute. So some institutions have clearly distinguished these as, let's say, blend flex courses, as University of Central Florida refer to them, so as to be distinct from sort of the purer form of a high flex course that emphasizes the flexibility and the student choice. One of the question groups that we identified was, how do we introduce faculty to blended learning if they've never done it before? And I know a lot of institutions have been scrambling to provide training and also, the appropriate technology to their faculty so that they can continue to teach in either a remote or a sort of hybrid situation. And so some of the questions that came in were about, orienting faculty, faculty professional development, having a long-term plan for faculty PD that even goes beyond COVID. And some of them were about technology. So I lumped a lot of these questions together, and we want to talk a little bit about, some of the best practices or some of the tips and tricks that we've heard of.
Yeah, and I like to talk about this one starting with the discussion first, because you're going to make mistakes as you're new to learning, and the very first thing you can do to counteract those mistakes is to make sure you have connectivity with your students. I have a picture on the left of an icebreaker a teacher did to be able to pull the students in and get them to introduce to each other. It happened to be a fashion class, and the students chose to unprompted, upload pictures of their shoes because it says a lot about them. And then the teacher got in there with them and really started developing that sense of community. And so, you can do prep work before the class starts, but that time that we're seeing people invest in sort of the initial get to know your community of learners, so that you have some shared, we're in this together, and shared sort of capital of, you know who I am, and if I make a mistake, that's okay, really kind of pays off a lot. And so when we see people who actively try to build community early in their discussion, in their section, we see that pays off in terms of activity throughout the section as you go, because you've developed that sense of trust and that sense of community.
Yeah. Yeah, and that idea of building a community in your class, I think also applies to instructor professional development as well. Marcus, I know you've seen examples of professional development happening via Harmonize. Do you want to talk a little bit about that use case?
Yeah, sure. So there's two things that are happening. So we actually helped put together a course that is using the online classroom to teach instructors how to do online education. So to be able to use the discussion tools and use your LMS to be able to run the instructors through what the best practices are. Hey, how do you set up an assignment? How frequently do you set up discussion forums? How do you do all of these things? But boy, putting them on the other side of the tools, and being able to let them feel what it's like to be a student, kind of does amazing things for not only having them really understand and learn from that perspective, but going from there. I just did see
Yeah,
a QA come through. Yeah, the shoe picture is Harmonize, is what Harmonize looks like when you're using it.
yeah. And we'll show some more screenshots and examples of Harmonize in practice here as we go.
Um,
Uh, yeah, go ahead, Marcus.
no, go ahead. We got it. We have a lot to cover. I'll
Okay.
stop talking.
So a number of these questions focused on, how do we help faculty orient their way through these trying times and begin to understand what blending is and how they can put it into practice. And I've got a couple of things that I can share. First is from Charles Graham's research on blended learning, where he says that one of the helpful constructs or models that we can think of when we're considering blended learning or working with faculty who are blending is that there are these three types of blends, and these blends relate to the outcomes that we might have for the use of technology and for our students. There's the enabling blend, there's the enhancing blend, and then there's the transforming blend. And the enabling blend is one that focuses on providing just greater access and convenience through the use of technology. And so that might be the use of Zoom, for example. It's a different way of accessing the course. It's a little more convenient for the students. An enhancing blend is one that uses technology to try to increase productivity and improve the experience. And so I think there you're finding that technology as an organizing tool itself can create greater productivity. But then going back to the online discussion example, right, where more students can actually participate and there's greater sense of classroom community by simple math of the fact that more students are participating can enhance that experience. The transforming blend is one that focuses on leveraging technology to actually change the instructional approach, the pedagogy, or to improve student outcomes. And I think what's interesting is that a transformative use of technology or a transforming blend uh, doesn't have to be an earth-shattering change to the course. Even the small research study that I showed about the use of online video as an instructional component is a transforming blend because it does by itself improve outcomes. By giving students greater control and the ability to self-pace can improve those outcomes. So, when thinking about helping faculty orient themselves to blending, I like to talk to them about these three different kinds of blends and look for ways that they can enable, enhance, and potentially transform. But you can also think of these as potentially a path, right? From small, medium to large. Enabling starts where you're at today. And that gets to some of the tips that I would provide for helping faculty. At a macro level, as you're thinking about professional development programs, of course, you want to market blending or online teaching or whatever it is you might be helping faculty to do. You want to create PD pathways, professional development pathways, so that faculty can start small and work their way up. And there's always a stream of workshops or offerings that they can engage with to level up or skill up. I love the idea of having walk-in help hours available for faculty to brainstorm ideas or to learn about technology. Of course, very few people are walking in anywhere these days, so it's a virtual walk-in help. And then also, we hear a lot about institutions implementing learning communities, whether that's department by department, finding faculty who have taught with technology or who have blended before, and either using them as a mentor for other faculty or going interdepartmentally and building communities of practitioners, those who are new to it, who are very experienced. I think by and large, showcasing faculty and their successes with technology is really the best marketing that you can have for any kind of professional development program. Because instructors, they respect their peers, they identify with their peers, and they are always looking to innovate themselves.
I
At a
could
smaller level, yeah,
if I
go
could
ahead.
jump if I could jump in on the macro level, because this parallels exactly what we see when we're trying to help institutions use our tool, is that really just an active focus pays off exponentially in terms of success. So if we come in and we're like, hey, use our new discussion tool, it's awesome, it allows video, blah, blah, blah. But there is no sharing, there is no help, there is no finding some instructors to use it and then having those instructors share their cases. then the tool doesn't get heavy adoption. But if just a little nudge in this direction, and we will see explosive growth because everyone's like, aha, the thing that Jared referenced in terms of transformative scares people, because they're like, don't throw any more technology at me, or don't throw a new
Yeah.
paradigm at me, or don't throw something. But if you can get someone to stand up and be like, no, this actually worked, and it was great, then you'll see that build so quickly in what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah. Finding ways to inspire faculties to try new things, or instructors to kind of push the limits, I think is important. And so thinking about working with individual instructors, I always like to start small, start where they're at, and focus on the basics. Even when you're talking about a fully online course or a blended course redesign, you don't want to scare people into thinking that everything has to radically change. You do want to start small. You do want to start with where they're at, and over time, as their fluency with technology grows, and with perhaps active learning online grows, they can try more and more things. I also like to orient instructors to the problems that they have faced in their traditional classrooms that they've not quite been able to solve. And maybe, for example, it's a problem of participation, that in the face-to-face discussions that they may have, some students are very vocal and tend to dominate conversations, and other students never speak up. Well, that might be a perfect opportunity for an online discussion. Or maybe it's that instructors say they find themselves repeating material a whole lot in class. Well, maybe that's a good chance to use video to record that instruction. So solving problems for instructors is very useful in motivating them to adopt technology. Also, distinguishing between the different modes. Online and face-to-face, they are different. They have different strengths, they have different weaknesses, and being really upfront and helping instructors identify the differences to distinguish between the modes can be really helpful when it comes to designing the courses, because then you understand that face-to-face is really valuable for this kind of thing, whether it's a hands-on activity or building a sense of personal community, whereas online is good for other things, and that might help them identify which of their learning activities should be done in which of those environments. Always focusing on the learning outcomes above all else is critically important, so that we're not just using technology for technology's sake. And always focusing on increasing active learning through the use of technology, or through the use of the face-to-face environment also can be really rewarding for faculty. So those are some tips on helping faculty blend. The next group of questions that we have focus on interaction. And boy, these were broad and far-reaching, but here's a snapshot of some of those questions. What research supports the use of discussion boards? How do we help faculty determine what to cover in face-to-face sessions versus online? What about video? How do we make sure students feel connected? A lot of different questions about synchronous, asynchronous, polysynchronous even, and technology as well. So we'll try to touch on some of these. Marcus, do you want to introduce folks to Harmonize a little bit, and show some of the things that help in this respect?
Yeah, and I picked things here that even if you're not using Harmonize, that you can accomplish. They're just things that we really try to grease the wheels and make it easier for people to do. So I didn't, some of them I pushed a little bit against that bound. But when you're talking about how to do those synchronous sessions, how often do you come together in Zoom or whatever your video platform is, like, and how do you blend that back into your asynchronous discussion? What we recommend and what we promote in our tools is like, look, create a discussion topic that actually has the prompt that makes people think ahead of time about what they're going to do. What are they going to do in that class when you come together as either a big group or a bunch of small groups? And then record that session, that what happens in that synchronous time. And then we go ahead and pull that back automatically into the discussion forum. But if you don't use us, grab that video, bring it back into the same discussion topic, either as a post or something, and then let the conversation continue. And that does a bunch of things. One, it makes sure you don't leave anybody behind. So if you have an equity issue, someone couldn't make the on-site or the in-person meeting, then they can come and they can watch the recording, or if they're ESL or if they're, or whatever the case is, they can come back and then watch what's going on. But really the important part of it is that you are prompting them to think about the specific thing that's going to happen in the class. You come together, you talk about it, you go back, and they're going to have an assignment that follows up and thinks about that in the same forums that they're talking, they're meeting, they're talking. And you can do this multiple times. And you can do it in small groups as well. So Canvas small groups are a great way to be able to, if you have a class that's a little too large for a Zoom session, to be able to create those small groups. We'll respect that and harmonize and pull them into Zoom, but you can do that in anything to say, this small group is going to meet in this Zoom session, this small group is going to meet in this Zoom session, and be able to pull them back together as they go. So it's really important to think, like, when I get together, what am I going to be talking about? I don't want to just talk for an hour because Zoom's tiring. How do I get them to think ahead of time in the discussion forum and go? And there was a really, I'll touch on this a little bit later, but in terms of actually being able to get that discussion going, student facilitation is one of my favorite things. This is a question from Valerie, to where you actually task some of your students with being thought-provoking discussion type thing. And so yes,
Mhm.
you can say respond to 3 of your peers, but if you actually have your peers out there and you as the instructor demonstrating what good discussion is, the research really shows that, like, especially with those student peer facilitators, it really drives students to try to be like that, and then rotate them through so they all have to facilitate, and it can really make for a much richer discussion. And then those students get graded on their facilitating of the discussion. They don't get graded so much on the content.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's this interesting dynamic at play, and I'll touch on that a little bit in just a moment, between, you know, having a discussion that is open to the students to talk about what they want to talk about, what's relevant to them concerning the course content, but also giving them the right guidance and modeling so that they know what kind of interaction is appropriate and is expected. Because at the end of the day, right, when you're using online discussions, you want to accomplish really a couple of different things. You want students to be engaged in the activity of learning through participation, but more importantly, you want students to be learning along the way. So discussions here, you know, I like the focus on the video content, whether that was from a live session or pre-recorded, and I like the focus on, you know, getting students some empowerment in this discussion.
And
One of
Joe,
the things, yeah, go ahead.
real quick, Joe asked about making a good quality versus a Zoom quality discussion. And honestly, I think that's beyond most people. Like, it's totally doable. You can do it. But instead, what I would say is create a comfortable environment in your classroom where students are totally fine with the okay Zoom recording. And if you can go above and beyond it, that's great. But that's a lot of work to ask. And so instead, try to create that comfortable sort of, it's okay. We're blending this, we're all in this together. There's going to be a Zoom recording. It may not be great, but so be it as we go.
Mm, yeah. Um, One of the things or one of the ways that's helpful to think about interaction in any course, but I think especially in a course that's leveraging technology, is that from a learner's perspective, there are three kinds of interaction, or three main kinds of interaction that can be happening at any given time or in combination. There's the learner to teacher interaction, whether that's direct instruction from the teacher or feedback or questions from the learner to the teacher. There's the learner to content interaction, which tends to be heavily weighted by instructors who are new to online or remote instruction. Critically important, but not the only kind of interaction there. And there's learner to learner interaction, which is learners consulting with their peers, collaborating, discussing, sharing ideas. They can get a lot of engagement and satisfaction from learner to learner interaction. So thinking about interaction from these three lenses, I think is helpful for instructors, especially as they're trying to balance, you know, how much content should I have online? What should I be doing in our live sessions or our on-site sessions? There is no perfect balance to these three in any given course. It's going to depend upon the subject and the learning outcomes, and of course, the preferences of both the instructor and the learner. But considering these three kinds of interaction and aiming for the right balance, I think is important and helpful. What we can also advise too, and this is based on research on student engagement and student outcomes, is that in any course, but especially in a remote course or a blended course, as Marcus was alluding to, you know, you want to start off with communication. Communication should be the foundation for the course. communication that is early and often, that is responsive to students' needs, and that exhibits the presence of the teacher. So teacher presence is very important in all kinds of courses, and we sort of take it for granted in a face-to-face course where the instructor is front and center in the classroom. But being felt and or having your presence felt in an online or blended course is every bit as important, and in some ways more important. So this presence can be felt by, as Marcus suggested, modeling the kinds of interactions in online discussions that you want students themselves to exhibit. A lot of instructors who teach online find that early on in the semester, they have to do a lot of the interaction in online discussions, but they can taper that off as the semester goes on, and as students begin to sort of pick up the responsibility for both, guiding the discussions and in some cases leading them. And third is making sure peer interaction is an important part of it, that it's not just student to teacher or student to content, but students are working with each other. And one of the best ways to do this at the beginning of any kind of course, online or blended, is by creating an open forum for students to ask questions on the course materials, on the structure or the requirements of the course, on anything at all, and encouraging them to answer each other's questions in that forum. That's a way of both offloading some of the potential work of the teacher, but also creating connections between those students. And of course, there's a lot of other ways around collaborative projects, group work, ongoing discussions, etc. Now, in terms of the online discussions themselves, as some of these questions have alluded to, there is some research that suggests that using online discussions is a powerful way to increase the sense of social presence in a course, especially at a distance, and that leads to increased student satisfaction. And I think satisfaction is an important outcome. It's something that I think is an outcome also related to engagement. But ultimately, we want to focus students on the kinds of online discussion activities that contribute to their learning as well. And so a relatively recent study or survey of research on online discussions found that these three components are really key, that an online discussion should be set up by the instructor to be authentic, that is, to be relevant, related to the course materials, perhaps honing in on some local or current events that it might be on the student's mind. It's really important here because that can be motivating for students to engage with the topic, but it can also help them connect the material of the course or the discussion itself with the knowledge or understanding they may already have in their minds, and that can, of course, lead to greater retention. The discussion should be student-centered. Now, that doesn't mean the students lead them, although it can, but that it is created with respect for students' participation, and that instructors are, encouraging to students, and that there is, there are standards of etiquette or netiquette, as we used to say, in those forums that are adhered to. And finally, that discussions are constructive. Now, this means that, of course, the tone of discussions should be positive and focused on a critical analysis of the content, but also that the feedback from instructors to students, whether that's private or in the forum, is constructive and conducive to the effectiveness and the participation of students with their peers. One further example of this is when discussions are used to focus on student projects or student work. That could be a really great way of making them both relevant and authentic and constructive in terms of the interactions that are happening there.
So I wanted to, in terms of keeping it authentic, just touch on some things that you should try to do. Everyone has a cell phone nowadays. If you can, when you're giving feedback or when you're doing whatever type of prompt and such, if you think, hey, can I do a 3-minute video on this? And I think, alluding to that, do we have to do video with Zoom? Like, you don't have to, like, you can record it on your phone. We facilitate that by putting it right into the Canvas app. But pull up your phone and make like a 30-second feedback, and boy, the connectivity and the engagement numbers we see from the instructor putting that face on it, or students doing that to other students as they go, really is pretty amazing. And then if you can find additional technology, it doesn't have to be our tools, but tools to be able to actually give some more granular feedback on, be it the images or the videos that you're actually looking at. The results we've seen from this in terms of language speaking classes and presentation classes and such, is to where if you can actually critique other people's videos as well, you get a lot richer feedback going back and forth between the students, and it creates that sense of like there is someone on the other end of this, crazy machine. I'm not just talking at a computer somewhere. Really does a lot of good.
Yeah, I love the use of video, especially in asynchronous discussions. It is a really interesting alternative to synchronous video. Uh, we do have to be careful about accessibility and make sure that students in our courses who have disabilities uh, are able to still get the content and the experience that they deserve. But here's a little testimonial from the Associate Academic VP at BYU Hawaii, where they've been using video in asynchronous discussions for a long time. One of the advantages that they find is, and this is, I think, similar to discussions in general, is that video allows students who wouldn't participate in class discussions to express themselves in a less intimidating environment.
Let me
So,
get on that accessibility
yes.
thing real quick. So important. I should have mentioned this. Caption your videos. We auto caption them with the service for you, but find some way to caption them if you are going to do video, because you're going to leave someone behind who can't participate in that way, and that would be really sad. So
Yeah, video really is a two-edged sword. I mean, we ourselves at Instructure, in looking at use of video in discussions, did find that students are much more likely to respond to a discussion post if it has video. But of course, the other side of that is that video needs to be accessible, it needs to be captioned, or you need to have a text transcript that represents the content of the video to those students. But technology is helping there. It's making it easier and easier to both add those captions directly or to use an automated service to have those done automatically. Uh, I'm going to go straight into this last section for the sake of time, which is dealing with organization in the blended course. A number of questions asked about best practices around designing a blended course. And I think in terms of setting up some of the different possibilities for structuring, we've touched on that just a little bit, but I can share some things that have come out of research on user experience or course design. There's not as much research here as I think the topic deserves, but let me share what I've found myself thus far. First is that in any course that's using technology, whether it's a face-to-face course that's simply web enhanced or a fully online course, you should think of the course homepage as the student's map. You should put yourself in the student's shoes and imagine that anytime they come to your course website, no matter where it lives, they're looking for what they need to do next. They're looking for what they need to do next and what they need to act upon, whether that's feedback or an upcoming assignment or discussion or whatever. And they're looking for sort of the pathway to get from point A to point B. And so what I'm showing on the right is a very simple template that is available for use in the design of a hybrid course. And I'll kind of zoom in here in just a moment on some of the important parts of this, but you'll notice at a very high level, it's linear, right? Students can very clearly see that in Unit 1, that covers a certain period of time, there are a number of activities and they go sequentially one after another. This is important as opposed to, what you might call sort of a bucket approach, where you would say all of the discussions are in this bucket and all of the readings are in this bucket and all of the quizzes are in this bucket, right? A sequential approach, a mapped approach is important. And some of the research that weighs this out came to us from Penn State University. Oh, I forgot, here's a pro tip. You can look for course templates like this on Canvas Commons. So a couple of years back, Penn State University did a study to find out what kind of course homepage students preferred. And they were on Canvas, but I think these results apply across learning management systems. And their research found that yes, students do prefer kind of the plain vanilla, but very organized and understandable sequential view that's offered through something like modules, where it's one item after another in the right order. And they also like to have a very clear sense of the assignments that are coming up and what they haven't yet submitted. So in terms of course design, sequencing everything, whether it's happening online or face-to-face, is really important. One of the other things that I think is important too, especially for instructors who are new to online, is to create some situations early on in the course where students can kind of figure out what the rest of the course will be like. So I love this example. If you hit this sign, you will hit that bridge. In terms of designing a blended course or an online course where technology is going to be a significant part of the semester, you want to make sure that students have a chance early on to understand how that technology is going to be used. Perhaps that's by providing a syllabus quiz if you're going to be using a syllabus that has some very strict requirements on it that students need to fully understand. Perhaps that's by having a sort of introduce yourself discussion forum so students can get used to using that technology. So there's a lot of different ways that you can help students prepare for the rest of the semester by giving them early experiences to kind of test things out that are low stakes, that aren't going to ruin their score once they finally get down to completing assignments and activities for points. And I think this idea too connects back to what Marcus was talking about in terms of using discussions to connect the live sessions with the video sessions. I think any blend that's using a combination of on-site and online learning needs to deliberately connect those two environments so that when students leave the on-site, they know exactly what to do. They're going to go online and it's going to be super clear and apparent to them what they need to do next. And in this particular example, right, we can use discussions to connect students from those on-site sessions to continued activity online. So if you're doing a really great discussion in Zoom or face-to-face, you don't have to end it when the bell rings. You can continue that discussion online, whether that's in an asynchronous forum, which is sort of ideal for this, or in live chat. And then before the next session, it's a really great idea for the instructor to reconnect what's been happening online to the upcoming live session. And that can be done simply by reviewing the posts, or the dialogue that's been happening, and preparing to summarize that or recap that or pull out salient points from online when the class is together in a live session. And of course, it can continue from there.
If I could highlight an example of this, we just took asynchronous questions. We got like 88 asynchronous questions, and it allowed us to build our content for the synchronous session we're now having as you go. And so we didn't know what we wanted to talk about. We didn't know what you wanted to hear. We asked a simple question. We got a lot of feedback, and we were like, oh, this is going to be easy. This is how we're going to group it. I think Jared did hit slides in like 10, 15 minutes, maybe a little more, because it was like, oh, these are great. Now my outline's built and everybody's connected to it, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, that's right. And discussions is sort of the example du jour because that's what Harmonize specializes in. But the activities that connect these environments don't have to just be discussions. You could, for example, have a quiz or a poll or an assignment submission that helps you as the instructor anticipate what you should focus on in the live session. And those can be the basis for the live session too. Perhaps a student project becomes the center of the live discussion where you can help model, both constructive criticism and appropriate and polite interaction. And so sort of elaborating on that with a couple of different examples of how you can provide students with both that sequential guidance and the connection between the two modes. I'm showing here on screen. In the example on the left, what you're seeing is the instructor or the designer has very clearly said, here are the things, class, that you need to do before we meet. And here are the things that we will be doing when we meet. Now, what's interesting here is that it doesn't necessarily have to be done face to face, even though the materials are online, right? It can be facilitated face to face, or it can be done virtually, as many of today's hybrid courses are doing. So just by putting the things online doesn't kind of cordon it off to that mode. It can work in both modes. And then you see it's followed immediately by what's going to happen after the class session. So this model on the left really focuses on the live class sessions, whether those are remote or face-to-face, helping students prepare for and move on from those live sessions. And on the right, this comes directly from that template I shared before. You can see here clearly that the live sessions themselves are indicated. These are just content pages. So they don't necessarily have a whole lot of material, but it could be a place where instructors are posting the recording of the video, or perhaps providing some preliminary notes for students who will be attending the live session. So again, the focus is on sequencing, on being very explicit. Not everything has to be fully fleshed out in the online environment, but the more that you can provide here in terms of that organization, that structure, the easier it'll be for students to navigate from point A to point B. And one pro tip for you guys, if you're using Canvas, start by creating just a single module, right? Create one unit or one lesson and use it as a template. Stub out the sort of things that are going to be happening every single week or in every single lesson. And once you've kind of stubbed that out as a template, you can just duplicate that template for every week or every lesson of the semester, and then go back in and fill in the details or add links to external tools like Harmonize. And that idea of setting clear expectations, Marcus, I know you're a big fan of this. I know you want to talk about this in terms of what Harmonize
Yeah,
can help with here.
both Valerie and Anne mentioned this in the Q&A, and it's something that we've seen the data support a lot, which is setting your clear expectations in the discussion as well. So we have a feature called milestones, but it's really just about communicating with your student. Hey, I want you to make one post by X date. I want it to contain this. I want you to ask a question or make 2 comments by the second date, and I want you to reply to 2 of your students' comments by the 3rd date, or whatever you want to configure. But the idea is, like, if you don't do this, you're going to get a bunch of students who open it at the start, they come in 10 minutes before the close, and you don't get that sort of dynamic discussion going on. So you have to sometimes use the expectations to drive the students in there early and be like, I can grade these. You're not going to get a great participation grade if you don't meet these deadlines. And that brings the students in to be able to talk. And what we're seeing in the data is super fascinating. Of if you put these in place, not only does it cause students to come in when these deadlines are there, but it also causes them to read more between. So when they're there, they go ahead and read, they check out, and we're seeing an increase in the actual consumption of other students' materials based on setting up these expectations for students. So taking what Jared was saying at the course level, at the module level, like your homepage has to tell them what's going on, your modules have to tell them what's going on. Also, your discussions need to tell them what the expectations are. And eventually you can start, this will cause good organic conversation to happen slowly. It'll be a little forced to start with, but then once you've got that interaction between your peers, you don't have to force it as much as the class goes on.
Yeah, and I know there are 2 opinions at least on the use of these kinds of due dates throughout the course of a discussion. Certainly, there are those who would like for students to just be intrinsically motivated to participate early and participate often or at the appropriate level, whereas others recognize that, well, human nature is one that procrastinates, and therefore, if we don't set up these requirements and due dates, then students won't participate in the very end, and then it is ineffective for attaining our goal of both engagement and increasing learning. So I think you choose what you want to use. If you want to leave it open-ended, great, but I think many instructors love the idea, and students do too, of being reminded when the first post is due or the subsequent follow-up comments are due, so they can stay on track. And I think over time, you can perhaps pull these back, or at least point out to students how having these stages really does result in a richer, more inclusive conversation.
Yeah, and I would also say that using analytics around these things as well, whatever your platform offers, look for the students that aren't actually participating. Look for the students who aren't getting the responses, because those students are in trouble. They're going to feel isolated. And so pull up and make sure you also don't have your own bias of like, I'm always responding to these students because they're brilliant, but these other ones need my attention as well. And to be able to figure out how to talk to folks, make sure, oh, these 3 students are super quiet. I need to call them out, tag them, comment on them, chat them up, whatever it is, to be able to get them back into the discussion.
Yeah. We have a few more minutes left, and it looks like a few more questions left. So before we wrap up, let's make sure that we have some of those questions addressed.
Jared, I don't know if I told you this, we were going to give away some of your books as well.
That's great. Appreciate
So,
it.
Jared writes a book on this topic. We're going to contact some of you afterwards and give away some of them. We'll do some drawing after the fact. I won't stall you with it here. It's the same as the AirPods that we'll give away as well as we go through. So looking at some of the questions, people feel free to get your questions in. Someone asked a little bit more about Harmonize, but let me see if there's any that are more theory-based before we get to that.
There was one on student facilitation, Marcus, if you want to touch on that. They were just looking for more information on that.
I can cover a little bit of it. I don't see that question, but if it's just what in general, the idea is you do that introduction at the start of the course. You get to know what are you familiar with this content, and then you start to pick your students based on what you know about them to say these 2 students, I'm making up 2, are tasked with going into the discussion and responding to other students. Their job is to pull out ideas and have provocative thought and conversations with other students as they go. And the next module, it can be 2 different students. And the next module, 2 different students. But when you give a student a position of power and a role, they feel good about it. They actually go out and participate more. And when the students learn from their peers, they also are practicing that interaction, that you get more organic interaction back and forth as you go. So it's a really, there's a blog article on our blog about it from a Dr. Weiss out on the East Coast, and she gets into the research of it and a lot of details of it. I can include that in the email follow-up we do with the recorded session as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, when we share that out, let's make sure I'll compile the references to the research articles that I've referred to, whether I was explicit or they were just mentioned on the slide, because, a couple of those speak specifically to different ways of getting students to begin to take some greater responsibility, whether that's, as you've suggested, or perhaps even leading discussions, or in the case of very large courses, there's a lot of benefit to putting students in smaller learning groups of 8 to 12.
Someone asked about breaking into small groups. Absolutely. Breaking into small groups is an amazing thing to do, especially if you're going to come synchronous at all. Like, it's okay to have 40 people in an asynchronous session. If you try to pull 40 people into a Zoom session, it's going to be tough. And so create small groups. We allow you to create, we respect the Canvas small groups. We actually let you take it private sometimes as well. You can do student to instructor, but figure out what works there, and then schedule those Zoom synchronous sessions for the small groups. Let the students schedule their own Zoom sessions. Let them come together in that way is super useful. And then mix those, well, there's two schools of thought. Either mix those groups up so that you can get different interactions, or if you're going to do continuity of groups, do like project work such that you have a thing that ties them together through as you go.
Yeah.
Research supports
Yeah.
both of those.
Yeah, and I would add, whether it's with the use of discussions or the use of groups, make sure that you have a clear instructional objective to using those. So in the case of using groups, right, perhaps the group is there to ensure a consistent understanding of the facts or the materials, in which case you may have groups organized so that each individual is sharing their summary or their takeaway from a session and debating or correcting each other or trying to come to a common understanding of the material. You might do something like jigsaws as well, which are popular in face-to-face classrooms, but can also be done online, where a student is assigned part of or a piece of the material to become an expert on, and then shares that with their group, and the group then shares sort of the bigger picture with the larger class. So there are ways that you can use groups and discussions to really emphasize learning and the progress of students toward those outcomes.
And Pranam, you asked about Harmonize. I'll just have someone follow up with you to answer your questions and show you what it is, so because we're out of time here. Parting last thoughts, if not?
We are out of time.
So thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, we appreciate the questions that you have brought in. Obviously, a very wide and diverse set of questions. One thing to keep in mind as you guys leave this webinar is, there will be a period where COVID is over. And even though right now there are some severe restrictions on what we can do face-to-face and how many people can participate, in the future, we don't want to lose the value of the on-site or the face-to-face interaction. We want to keep that in our minds as we're thinking about how do we maximize student outcomes and interaction with the use of technology to support it and to create greater flexibility.
Jared, could you hit the next slide? Perfect. So the president of the United States Distance Learning Association is going to do a webinar with us talking about best practices for online discussions. We did this once before with her and we messed up the recording. So she offered to do it again for those that missed it. So you can come out. It was super popular. And she's got a lot of good concrete advice as well that sort of mirrors not just blending, but just in general, like her in the trenches for 20 years as a teacher, as a head of this organization. What does she see that works? With that, I will say goodbye to everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Take care.